Today's guests are Karl X and Martin Quigley. We join their conversation in the Faculty Lounge.
Is the cultivation of plants. Now, in plant sciences, you have the basic science, which is botany. How do plants relate to each other? It's the evolution and taxonomy is botany. Then you have plant physiology. How do plants function, like any other cell physiology or organismal physiology? Then there's agronomy, which are the grain crops, you know, rice, wheat, all the major things. That is the farming stuff. But horticulture is focused more on the fruits and the ornamentals. And those are the plants that, you know, people use in their everyday lives. But when you think about it, culturally, historically, human beings didn't used to make a distinction between plants for ornament and plants for utility. You know, the very first tribe...
We do now?
We do now, yes indeed we do. There's
Yeah.
a nursery industry for ornamental plants, and there's a fruit industry for strawberries or oranges or apples or whatever, and then there's the agribusiness for corn and soy, which are the big grain crops here in the US, and for rice in Asia, and for millet in Africa. You know, every culture has its main grain crop, every culture. Most of them are grass-based, like rice and wheat and corn. Some of them are not, like quinoa in South America.
What is that?
Quinoa. It's an amaranth. Quinoa was the staple grain for all the South American cultures on the West Coast, but the Spanish...
What do you eat after
you make a bread-like substance out of it.
Really?
Yes.
So rice is
It's a starch. It's
okay, it's a starch.
Yeah, it's a starch, the way rice is in Asia. But
what does it look like?
The conquistadors, it's well, the celosia, the coxcomb, it's a little ornamental plant now that most Americans know as annuals, little red fuzzy flowers all summer long. That's a shortened miniature version of the amaranth of South America, the quinoa.
The quinoa.
The quinoa, but the conquistadors, as part of the subjugation of the native peoples, the conquistadors forbade them to plant it or eat it and made them eat wheat instead. You know, this has been the history of human colonialism. For instance, you know, in well-guided efforts, for instance, in the Green Revolution in the 50s in India, UNESCO and all these international food agencies went to India and said, okay, well, you know, rice agriculture is way too water intensive. You have to do something that's more adapted to your dryland culture. Here, do wheat. Well, you can't go to, you know, 500 million people and say, well, what you're eating is wrong. You have to eat this instead. Right. And so it all fell apart. But in
chefs would lose jobs.
Nothing with chefs. It's just subsistence agriculture. Anyway, so my point was, way back when, you know, people started, instead of just hunting and gathering, you know, traditionally humans were hunters and gatherers. You know, the men sat around and every once in a while they'd go out and kill some protein. The women worked every day gathering nuts and berries and grubbing for roots. And
Are you sure about that?
Yes,
okay.
yes
well,
indeed.
We don't get the credit.
No, none at all.
Not even for one brief moment in history that we were the...
males are pretty much superfluous except as sperm donors, especially when it comes to the history of agriculture.
Okay.
I mean, in Africa, still in traditional cultures, the men only hunted.
You're not being just politically correct.
No,
okay.
absolutely not.
Okay.
But anyway, my point is, one day, you know, some woman noticed that where she spilled some seed last year, there was a slightly denser patch of it, and so she probably threw out some and said, let's see. And the next year, so farming began, you know, as human settlements stopped moving around and, you know, had the resources to actually cultivate something, and then they started protecting it from animals, and then they started trading it, so a woman who grew extra starch could trade it for some protein that man just dragged in. And so the whole history of human culture was based on the manipulation of plants, you know, of having a stable food supply. Unlike proteins, which decomposed rapidly, these starches could be dried and stored. So you could actually have a surplus for winter or a surplus for the dry season. But what I was getting to, the beginning of human gardening, you know, the oasis that we have in the Judeo-Christian myth, the oasis wasn't a natural oasis. It was a walled garden in which every tree had fruit, or every plant gave us something, whether it was food or cotton such as fiber or papyrus. So every plant had a utility. If it had scent and flowers and beauty in addition, that was all to the good. but the gardens of antiquity were gardens of utility. Now, you know, somewhere in the Christian era, in the last 2,000 years, utility, you know, the food crops and the fiber crops have diverged from the ornamental crops, the things we grow for flowers or for ornament. But when you think about the sustainable landscape, and this is my drive not just as an ecologist, but as a landscape architect, that even the residential landscapes we have today should represent utility as well as beauty. You know, if I'm going to harvest my lawn,
there's no utility.
There's no utility. So why not reduce the lawn and have ground cover of strawberries so that when I harvest something, it's something I can eat, as opposed to something that has to be hauled away or composted or done with. So if I'm going to, you know, put all this time into a landscape that I control, I want something back out of it, whether it's scent, whether it's flowers, or whether it's fruit. And so how I came to the Arboretum directorship is a marriage of science and art. I was a landscape architect. I had a terminal degree in landscape architecture and practiced it for 10 years. And I burned out on the real estate aspects. You know, I thought landscape architecture was a perfect profession because it combined naturalism and engineering and geology and plants. And, you know, it was a holistic way of approaching man's relationship to his environment.
But not a lot of people buy into that
No,
idea.
they don't. It turned into real estate. And since I knew my native plants and I had, you know, certain design skills, you know, I was being used to put a good show on what was amounted to clearing off land, and in this country, the improvement of land. You know, we're a Puritan country at heart. We still are. And in
Meaning?
You know, who were the Puritans? The Puritans were a group of people in England who decided that everyone around them was having way too much fun. Sex, drugs, you know, dancing. And the Puritans got themselves on boats and came over to Massachusetts where they could be sure that they wouldn't have any fun and nobody else would either. And they believed God told them this.
Are they still living today, these
Well,
people?
their descendants are living and we are them. Because think about it. The Puritans wanted to make sure that nobody was having fun. Part of the problem was you could have fun if you were off by yourselves, hiding. And so the woods were evil places. The woods, God's law ended where the cultivated fields ended. And so if every American high school student reads The Scarlet Letter. It was one of the first novels in American literature, The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And the doomed young preacher, Arthur Dimmesdale, and Hester Prynne, the adulterous young woman, had their liaison. And where did they go? They went to the woods. And the woods were the symbol of all that was evil and uncontrolled. And the American ethic, the conquest of this continent, starting with the European settlement, was to clear the land of its forests and to replace it with tidy, orderly rows of crops. And in the Homestead Act, 3 centuries later, all through the 19th century into the earliest 20th century, when Americans had this surplus land and it was being settled, how did they establish ownership? First, you went out there and lived there. How did you improve your land? You improved the land by cutting down the forest, by removing the natural vegetation, and putting in a human landscape of row crops and orchard trees. And that proved your ownership and your intention to use this land properly in a godly way, was to remove the natural vegetation. Now, ironically, as ornamental vegetation has come back, you know, we want to decorate our environments. We decorate inside our house. We decorate outside our house. The American ideal for the ornamental landscape is the English lawn, you know, pure, pristine grass, one species, evenly cut, constantly tended, you know, with maybe some flowers around the edge.
So you mean the green grass hills of England, that wasn't even natural?
No, no. Grass wants
Really?
rain. No, not to America. Look what they do here in Florida. It's an uphill battle to have what they call a lawn here. It's horrible.
Interesting. You should mention that. Maybe a week ago, maybe a little further back, there was an interesting newspaper report of a self-made millionaire building or buying, building a $4 million house.
Oh, the one with the AstroTurf?
Yeah. How do you view that?
Well, in some ways, obviously, he had perfect right. You know, it was his house. He could do what he wanted. If he wanted to put plastic out front, fine. But this only supports my idea that Americans are very much concerned with what their neighbors are doing, how their neighbor's house looks. This is very Puritan. You know, this is very much in our Puritan tradition that you must do the way your neighbors do. And the idea that the lawn is a symbol of conformity and good Christian behavior is absolutely ingrained in our national culture. Somebody once famously wrote that a man can cheat on his taxes and beat his wife and the neighbors will ignore it. But if a man lets his lawn go to pot, the neighbors will rise up in an association and come to him and tell him that he must reform his behavior, because that reflects on the community. And so the idea of this common green, New England was based on a principle of villages around a common green, which when used wisely would allow everybody to bring their dairy cow and eat there. China had commons too, before the population pressures got too great. But if somebody got greedy and they brought 10 cows one day, their cows would eat all the grass, and then the commons were ruined. So that's a whole different argument about environmentalism. But as far as the lawn is concerned, the lawn is the symbol of the pride in American home ownership. And it doesn't make any difference if you're in Miami or Montana. Everybody wants that same lawn, and it's based on a landscape model that worked in England, where you have fertile soils and constant moisture.
It rains all the time,
That's
right? At least the stereotype of it.
And you can't do it here except with a high input of petrochemicals. How were lawns invented? Do you know how lawns were invented? They were invented by an association between the
soccer players did that.
No, the golfers, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which was selecting for seeds that actually made a turf, and the American Home Beautiful movement toward the end of the 19th century. You know, lawns were actually invented in this country. In England, lawns were the product of the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, before they had cloth mills that, you know, made threads, that made fabrics, before that, you know, every small farmer, whether he was an owner or, you know, a tenant on a big estate, had little stone-walled enclosures where he grew his animals and his crops. When the cotton mills and wool spinning mills were requiring more raw materials, the little small crofters, the small farmers, were displaced. They went to work in the factories, the walls were broken down, and the sheep were let to graze. So these huge area, the big landowners opened up their lands, and the result of this constant grazing was a lawn, a very dense turf. It wasn't all grass. It was, you know, 30 or 40 different species, but it looked beautiful. It looked beautiful. So the idea of this big estate that Americans have, Americans always see these movies, you know, with this vast lawn and some beautiful trees and a big house. Well, what they didn't see, that 6 days of the week that was covered with pooping sheep all over the place, you know. It was an agricultural landscape. And so in the 19th century, the Americans who began to form a middle class here wanted to imitate that, and their garden books, starting in the 1840s, came from England. Lawns around a big house. Now, in the 1840s also, the lawnmower was invented. And you know what the lawnmower was invented from? It was a large-scale model of a fabric cutter. In these cloth mills in England, there was a rotary blade that cut the loops off and made velvet. It made, and so somebody hitched up a bigger one and tied it behind his wife or a horse or somebody and pulled it around the grass. And so at the same time, we had the lawnmower, the lawn grasses that were selected by agronomists, and we had the explosion of the suburbs. In the 1840s, all of a sudden we had the railroad. For the first time, it was possible to live in the country and work in the city. Before that, you either lived in the city or you lived in the country. Country people had greenery around them. City people did not, except for the odd park or two. Now, what makes America unique was it was a new country that was invented. Most American cities were planned with park space in them. You go to old European cities, there wasn't anything green, you know, until cities grew to encompass surrounding woods. So all of a sudden, in the 1840s, you had the railway, you had the lawn seed, you had a way of maintaining it, and within 2 generations, the idea that a house had to have a lawn was absolutely encoded in the American mentality, and we still have it today.
Dear God.
You cannot sell a house without a lawn. I had a house in Illinois. I had changed the entire front to ground covers, shrubs, beautiful perennial flowers. Complete strangers would stop their car and ask if they could come and see my garden and walk through it. The neighbors hated it because it was different from their lawns. And sure enough, when we had to move and sell it, I had to take out the front third and put it back into grass. Because otherwise, the real estate said, this will never sell. And I said, why? It's beautiful. She said, yes, but it's different. It's different.
Now, after learning a little bit of so much history behind this idea, when it first happened to me, I think it was very much of a culture shock.
That you had to take care of a lawn?
No.
Your first house, when you bought your house.
Receiving the letter from the Homeowners Association. Oh,
you got the letter?
Oh, yeah,
your lawn looked bad.
Well, there are dead patches. I said, that's heat, natural.
That's right.
And they said, well, you have 30 days to take care of the dead grass. And I almost replied and said, that's impossible.
Oh no, it isn't. Chemicals, better living through
Yeah,
chemicals,
it's
fertilizer,
impossible to do.
pesticides,
Right.
irrigation.
But the language was very, very strong.
Exactly.
And I think it ended with, if you don't do it, we will do it, but
And
we will charge you for it.
That's right.
But now
You're bringing down the property values. This happens so often. There was this great story about a woman who came with her husband. I think her husband was a diplomat. Anyway, they came from Africa, and they were living in suburban Washington, D.C. in Maryland. And in Africa, you don't have a lawn because, you're afraid of vermin getting into the house, scorpions and snakes for the children. And so she went out and took her big old tool and beat it down until it was dead, and had a nice swept dirt area around the house, which is what you do in Africa to keep things from crawling in the house. I mean, one of the reasons we like lawns here is because you can see the pests coming. But in Africa, where there are even more parasites and more things to worry about, the tradition is to have beaten dirt. Well, this woman was taken to court for killing her lawn and having beaten dirt around the house, and she really didn't understand it. She was doing what her culture had ingrained as the proper way to maintain your property, and here you must do what the neighbors do. And then again, the Puritan ethic comes in. They will shun you, they will punish you, they will fix it and charge you to fix it if you don't have a proper lawn.
Absolutely. I grew up in the city of Beijing, and
well, you know about conformity then.
Right. Not really. Actually, Beijing is a free-spirited city. About if you want to use the label liberal, I think people from Beijing are about the most liberal.
Because they're more urbane, probably. A big city, you can hide more than you could in a village.
I think it has to do with they've been through enough and seen enough, and so. But let's talk about the Arboretum, and several things I've noticed. I've read a few times about UCF's, well, the concern for the Arboretum in the overall strategic plan of UCF's development. I've noticed this, something already. It's shrinking in its size. And what's going to be your role?
What's the deal?
What's going to be your role?
Well, my hire was actually a way of the university reaffirming its commitment to the Arboretum. The Arboretum is still the same 80 acres that it always was. What you're seeing is other developments circling in on lands that were always intended to be developed.
Oh, I see.
My job is to make the Arboretum so attractive, such a public image, that it would be impossible to develop it.
Okay.
And there are actually two parts of it. There's the old part, which I'm going to redevelop into biogeographical gardens. Instead of just saying, oh, here's a bunch of pretty plants like a display garden, I'm going to organize them by where they came from. Here we are in Florida. Plants from around the world have been brought by collectors, by business people.
Chinese sailors.
Everybody, by Chinese sailors. Everybody. The history of humankind is the history of plant movement for utility, for beauty, for soap, for scent, for everything. So instead of just grouping them by color or size or texture or doing a garden plan, I think a university arboretum has a job in presenting plants according to some kind of principle, and one of them will be where they came from. So I'll have the South African plants grouped together, the Indo-Chinese plants grouped together, the Australians, the Mediterraneans, and that will make sense of how these plants relate to each other. So a garden shouldn't be just a collection of specimens. A garden is an ecosystem in miniature, but a functioning ecosystem. So that's the old part within the highly developed part of campus. Then there's the natural areas, and this is the part that most people don't even know. So many universities have woods, Harvard Woods in Massachusetts, the Cornell plantations. So many universities have beautiful preserves of woods where so few people go, and we're no different. We have pristine ecosystems that came through all the storms practically undamaged. Oak hammocks, pond pines, pitcher plants.
I guess we're lucky being in the middle of Florida. Right. So by the time a hurricane hits us, it's
well, not this year,
not
but
much excitement
in general. But the problem is, now our natural areas are fragmented, and this is where I leave behind being a landscape architect and a designer, and I go into being an ecologist. And that is, how do we maintain these forest fragments so they actually aren't going to go extinct? Everybody knows about, population bottlenecks, like the Florida panther. There might be only 25 Florida panthers still alive.
Is it really true?
Really, and if there are that few, and we know that there are some deleterious genes in this few number of individuals, that they're already extinct. You know, they may be still running back and forth across the road, and every once in a while one gets hit. But, you know, functionally speaking, biologically speaking, they're already extinct.
It's beyond the point of no return.
That's right.
Yeah.
Although they're interesting stories. For instance, the elephant seals in California, they were down to a population that I think included only 8 males 100 years ago or less than 100 years ago, and now they're back up to thousands of healthy organisms, and they seem to be fine again. So it depends. But what I'm saying as far as natural areas fragmentation, and this isn't just Florida, this is the entire country, as cities have grown up, and America's always had the privilege and luxury of lots of extra land, we have green areas, whether they've been farmed at one point or ranched at one point. We have lots of green areas. Our challenge now is to manage them in a way that is not going to require a lot of artificial input. And one of the things we have to do here is burn our forests. I mean, the history of the Florida landscape is one of fire, and part of the problem with the UCF campus is that it hasn't been burned in 50 years. The fuel loads are unbelievably high.
Actually, there was a small fire.
Yeah, it was an accident. 2 days after I took the job, I got an email that said, "Oh, and by the way, your Arboretum's on fire," and they sent some digital pictures.
But they're digging around that. So how
That's
big
a water
exactly?
line.
Okay.
That's a water line going through. No, but that is the corner of the natural areas.
Okay.
And there's a lot of utility now to connecting. What we're finally recognizing, it isn't enough to save patches, you need corridors that connect. And the way to connect the corridors is usually drainage areas. And especially in Florida, where water is much more regulated than other types of terrain, we're using the waterways and the channels to connect these green pieces, which means there can be some gene flow. Okay. You know, without species movement.
Well, isn't that unnatural in a sense? Like I saw big pipes with purple ribbons on them.
Oh, that is reuse water. Actually, it's a good project. The city of Orlando has extra water from its sewage treatment plants, and instead of processing it and putting it back into the waterways, it's now going to be distributed and used for irrigation water. So they're using treated water instead of new, fresh, potable water from the aquifer. So that huge new water project is for the distribution of treated water. That's a good thing. Yeah. But the problem of the Arboretum is that it's not a high-impact facility. It's not like a laboratory. You know, if you have some kind of molecular laboratory or some photonics laboratory with a lot of lasers, you can show people, I have $1 million worth of equipment and here's the kind of research we're producing. If you take that same group of people out to the woods and you say, okay, we have a long-term project going here monitoring songbird health and migratory animals coming through here, there's nothing you can point to and say, this is the result of our research. Even though you're working in a huge system, even though you have target organisms, the idea of landscape as a research facility is way too diffuse for most people to cope with. And so part of my job is not just to make it pretty and not just to make it function, but also to make the university treat it as any other research resource or facility. And if I can do that, I'll really have succeeded. I don't know if I can.
So in that regard, would there be a degree program associated with your work or research or this
well,
this
there could
altogether?
be. At some universities, our university does not have a horticulture or landscape architecture department.
How many universities do that?
A lot.
Really?
Dozens. Maybe hundreds. There are lots of horticulture programs. In Florida, I think we have a no-compete agreement with Gainesville, with UF at Gainesville. They have extension and agriculture and horticulture. But UCF grew up in a whole different mold. The way it has developed does not have that. So I don't think that my Arboretum will have a degree program associated with it. What I can offer, not just to biology, but even to psych and social in the video department, I can offer a research facility for them to get a little bit more interdisciplinary. It's an environment. The Arboretum is not so much a place as a set of principles, of landscape management principles. It's all very fluid. They're very passionate environmental defenders of not just the Arboretum, but all the campus green spaces, and they'd kind of like to see a fence go around it. Not just a metaphorical fence against development, but a physical fence, barrier. But you can't do that. The history of the constructed landscape is human impact on the environment and that feedback between the environment and humanity.
Nothing would have symbolized it more than a fence.
Yeah, like don't come in here.
Right.
Of course, Americans are good at that. Look at the invention of barbed wire. You know, it used to be, again, you know,
Really?
the undeveloped landscape was for common use, cattle, buffalo, whatever, but the end of the American West was signaled by the invention and wholesale installation of barbed wire fences starting in the 1860s. Between the railroads and the barbed wire, the whole American ideal of the cowboy, that was only two generations of these cattle drives and that whole cowboy culture between the time it started and between the time, instead of going across the plains with the horses and the cows, they'd load them onto railroad trains and ship them to the slaughterhouses in Omaha or Chicago. But we have this very romantic idea of what the cowboys were. That was a very brief time in American history when the prairies were open, and then we closed them off again. And again, the whole history of settlement in the U.S. has been a fragmentation between agriculture and roads and railroads. We've stopped the movement of animals. We've stopped the spread of natural fires. You know, why were there great prairies in the Midwest? Fire and buffalo, huge herds of grazing animals, the Native Americans, the Amerindians, setting fires to control them, to move them. And without buffalo and without fire, there are now trees replacing where prairies used to be. You know, the whole landscape has shifted. And so I think the idea in preservation or restoration ecology is to find out how these systems function and how we can manipulate them to keep our species diversity and somehow to make it appealing. I mean, people don't like virtue. And that's part of the problem with selling an environmental agenda. It sounds like you have to take medicine. You know, you have to do something you don't want to do. Yeah. Virtue is not appealing. Sex is appealing. People do things because they're forced to, which we don't like, or because they want to. But you ask people to do something they ought to do. You know, they ought to do more charity. And they'll avoid it if they can. And so you ought to recycle. Well, how many people are really, truly committed to recycling everything or reusing or recycling? Not very many, because you can do it or not, and nobody comes to your house and makes you do it.
That's right. There's no recycling police.
That's right. And there's no environmental police either.
The rumor, I think I first learned that from the controversial movie maker, Michael Moore. I think in his, one of his funny little books, he said recycling is a sham because they don't really recycle it. Is that true?
Yes, it is unfortunately true that you know, recycling only works when there's a market for the recycled materials. And many cities, you know, virtuously set up recycling programs, but there was nobody to actually use the stuff they were collecting. And in fact, I lived in a small town in Illinois where it was found after a couple of years that the recycling company was taking all the recycled materials and going out to the dump with the rest of the garbage and dumping it in. So they were getting a premium for collecting and separating, and then it was dumped with the rest of it. So recycling only makes sense when you're committed at every level. So it's not just a bunch of, you know, homeowners putting out their little recycle bins with their plastic and their metal and their paper. It's all